Shabbat Shalom. Today we're going to do a study on one of the famous prophets in the Torah, but then a prophet of the heathen people, the pagan people. They also have their prophets. It's not only them, it's the Greek who had their prophets, the Romans, old cults all had their prophets to speak and to be in touch with their gods. The Greek had Greek women prophetesses who were hanging above rock openings, and smoke came up, sulfur or very poisonous stuff. They didn't make it very long. Didn't become very old in their lives, and because of that they got drunk on those fumes, and then they spoke their words of wisdom. So also today Mr. Balaam, however you want to pronounce his name, and he is in the picture. Let's read and see how he was also making use of the Spirit of God, the God of Israel. Not because he is so clever, but because God was enabling him to do that. And that is an interesting thing because it evades the theories of when to speak with the Spirit of God in you. It evades that kind of theology. God does however he wants to do things. And in this story that is very clear. Let's read the first text, and then also keep in mind the question that I'm going to try to answer today. Should we stop? Should we grow into the level that this man had, Balaam, or should we grow more than, and of course the latter is the case. There we go. The children of Israel traveled and encamped in plains of Moab, beyond the Jordan River at Jericho. Balak the son of Zippor saw all that Israel had done to the Amorites. Remember that name. I'm going to talk about it a little bit. The Amorites. Moab was very afraid of the people because there were many. And Moab was distressed because of the children of Israel. Moab said to the elders of Midian, "Now this multitude will lick up all that is around us, as the ox licks up the grass of the field." Well, they don't lick, but they use their tongue in order to bite it. But that's another story. Balak, the son of Zippor, was king of Moab at that time. He sent messengers to Balaam, the son of Beor, the prophet of the pagans, to Pethor, which is by the river, to the land of the children of his people, to call him, saying, "Behold, there is a people who came out of Egypt. Behold, they cover the surface of the earth," or of the land, the same word, "and they are staying opposite me. Please come now, therefore, curse me this people, for they are too mighty for me. Perhaps I shall prevail, that we may strike them, and that I may drive them out of the land. For I know that he whom you bless is blessed, and he whom you curse is cursed." So this is the thing. Here is a man who is able to do these things. He's known to do these things. Also with the Greek prophetesses in the Greek time, a world power at the time. People from all over came to these oracles in Delphi and stuff like that in order to gain wisdom. Now this is done by this person, this leader, to consult with a spiritual leader of the faith that they both had. And there is a spiritual warfare going on, and that's what we are dealing with in this piece of history. It all started with the refusal to give entrance by the king of those Amorites that Balak was talking about, and his name was Sichon. Israel, we need to get a picture straight. What was Israel doing entering this land of Canaan? Were they just coming in like trampling all over the country and having military victories over all the peoples there and just fighting them to the death and stuff like that? No. They knocked on the door politely and they asked if they could have entrance in order to pass through that country in order to get to the other side and to move on. And they promised to behave neatly and stuff like that. This is how they did it. If they hit on resistance and a military power that was trying to attack them, that was a different story. So Israel always promises a country where they knock on the door and ask to travel through it, to behave neatly. Sichon didn't trust them. And when the Israelites under Moses came to the east side of the river Jordan, there was this leader Sichon leading and governing over the mighty Amorites. And his king, his royal palace was located in Heshbon, was the Hebrew name. He had a very important victory. He got that on the Moabites, and he chased them across the river, the Arnon, to the south. The Ammonites, he had already driven away from the Jordan to the east. Because of that, his whole area was situated from the Arnon River in the south to the Jabbok River in the north, and the Jordan Valley, even to the Lake of Galilee in the west. So we can read this. We were able to read this in last week's text. We read it there as well that after this war, Israel moved on. It traveled and continued their trip, and they continue and they arrive at this land of Bashan after that. It was the area and the land of Og, a mighty warrior, a king and warlord, king of Bashan, who is always mentioned in one of the same sentence with this person Sichon, king of the Amorites. And the land of Og was bordering in the north to the land of Sichon. The Midianites lived in the southeast of his area, of his land, as nomads, and they had to pay their taxes to Og. After Sichon refused for the Israelites to go through his country to the West Jordan area, Sichon was then, he had to capitulate. He was killed in the war that resulted as an answer, where the answer was no, done by him and his people. His land was taken over by the Israelis, and it was but not because the Israelis were keen to win this land and to have the victory over it and to just steal it. This was the result of this refusal of this king, who was not so wise and was not so peaceful in his way of handling things. And so the country was taken over by Israel, and it was the first part of the promised land that Israel got in possession, not by power, by means of expansion of their territory, but as a welcome byproduct of hostile behavior against which Israel had to defend itself. This area was given to Reuben and Gad. The fact, this is important now, because the fact that Israel won the war against the Amorites under the leadership of Sichon, the fact that Israel had won that war brought Balak, the political leader in the story that we read today, brought Balak into fear. He was king of the Moabites, and which is strange that Balak was becoming afraid of the Israelites. Because it's true that this big boss, Sichon, was killed by Israel, but it was this Sichon person who had captured and taken over the Moabites. In other words, it would be interesting for Moab, who was king of the Moabites, to be glad. He should be glad with what Israel did. It's kind of a military action which, with a revenge in it, and to the advantage of Balak. Logically speaking, he should be the friend of the enemy of his enemies, but he wasn't. Balak was in fear for the Israelites because he didn't think along this logical line. Why? This is important. Why? Because Balak hated the God of Israel. These things go by spiritual warfare more than we might realize. This God of Israel promised love and personal victory in personal lives, and asking for being low in humbleness, shall I call it, of believers in the God of Israel. The God of Balak, on the other hand, promises cruel oppression and military victory and proud arrogance to believers in him. Two gods. If you don't know any better, you might say that all the gods are the same and all the religions are the same. They are not. The God of Israel, you were allowed to not speak the truth totally, if that would save people's lives. The God of Balak, you could lie if you could finish the lives of people. The God of Israel, you were supposed to bring the best and the most beautiful of character and features in other people, and take part in that as well, and ask God to do this, enable the other person, and participate in the growth of this other person, especially people closer to you than other people, but all the same. With the God of Balak, it was different. You are allowed to bring the best and the most beautiful within yourself, and let that come up, and have other people assist in you becoming the best person, better than all the other people. Competition and stuff like that. The God of Israel is demanding that his believers apply his word from A to Z, from the beginning Genesis to the end of the Bible, whatever your end, what you see as your end, in their lives. The law should be followed. The God of Israel is demanding this, and the God of Israel also describes in the Bible that Messiah is the same in applying the law of Moses in his life. Like David on his deathbed is asking his son, who's taking over, Solomon, to be faithful to the law and the Torah and the prophets. And this is what Yeshua says. He says, I didn't come to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them. And I'm asking you to do the same. Read Matthew 5 verse 19 and you'll see that. The God of Balak has nothing. It doesn't want anything to do with Torah. Now be careful, because in certain aspects, if you say, well, Torah is done, I don't have anything to do with it, it's over, it's fulfilled, so we don't do anything with it anymore. That's God of Balak talk. Don't do that. Resulting in hating Israel. You never know what might be alive or come to life in those kind of ways of thinking. Interesting is the moment on which Balak is attacking Israel. He didn't do this when it was captured and caught and held prisoner in the land of Egypt. He knows about that his part of history, but he leaves them alone while that is going on. You find it in Numbers 25 verse 5, 22 verse 5, I'm sorry. Where I read on the screen as well, he sent messengers to Balaam, the son of Beor, to Pethor, which is by the river, to the land of the children of his people, to call him, saying, Behold, there is a people who came out of Egypt. See, he knows what he's talking about. And he leaves them alone while in Egypt, but then later on, when they are strong and a mighty army, then he attacks them. And that is not only then, it's repeated later on in history. Behold, they cover the surface of the earth, and now they're staying opposite me. So when Israel was helpless and was in captivity, you didn't see Balak. But now that it became mighty and was on its way to start their own country and their own economics, their own army already, and stuff like that, Balak started his war against Israel, starting on a spiritual level with this Balaam guy. When Israel lived in the land in 1948, wasn't helpless anymore, and had their own resources and army and protection systems and everything, police and army and intelligence. The day after the state of Israel was proclaimed, the day afterwards, Israel was attacked by 6 countries, neighboring countries. It was the day after the establishing of the state on May 14, 1948. On May 15, those Arabic armies of 6 countries, Egypt, Syria, Jordania, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, attacked Israel. It's so different now with new pacts made and stuff like that. And they were called to do this, and they were blessed by their spiritual leaders. Before this 1948 moment, in World War II, Hitler and the great Mufti of Jerusalem, Muhammad Amin al-Husseini, family of Arafat and friend of what later is Turkey, made a pact with each other to solve what they call the Jewish problem, the Jewish existence. This is the problem that Balak had with Israel as well. This great Mufti was very popular until the end of World War II. After that he fled. He got asylum in Egypt by the Muslim Brotherhood. Died in 1974 when he was 79 in Lebanon, not in Jerusalem. That's where he was buried. And in World War II, there was another spiritual Christian leader who was doing his blessings in the war against Israel. This was Pope, Roman Catholic, Pope Pius number 12, who blessed the weapons of the German army. This cannot be the God of Israel. So you need to see how this goes, how a Christian guy can just jump from one God to the other one when he does these kind of things. Defended by his brothers later on, stuff like that. So this piece of history is only there, I'm giving it to you to see the spiritual battle where Balak is involved in. Balaam as the spiritual leader of his time. He was able to say nice things, but his donkey could do the same. There's this situation described in this piece of text today, where you see Balaam traveling with his donkey, where God already told him in a dream the night before, don't go. He did it anyway. And his donkey was watching an angel standing in the way, and the angel stopped and didn't want to go forward again anymore. But he said, this donkey said interesting things. So there's this Balaam guy who hates Israel. This is why Balak is hiring him. And after God is teaching this Balaam leader a lesson in who is the one who gives the good words, this Balaam goes with the soldiers who are picking up Balaam to bring him to Balak. According to the Bible, he's a fortune teller. A kasam is the Hebrew word, and his sayings are kesem. There is sometimes a word of interesting, beautiful beauty that we will come to see a little bit later on, and we can call it a sort of prophecy, but the rest is just nonsense. Our great sage Maimonides talks about this, and he says the following words. It's coming on the screen as well. My mother says prophets grow in levels of spiritual insight. At one of the lower levels of being a prophet, is speaking of the person as being inspired with the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit. And Maimonides adds to this that this Balaam was at that level when he was good. Then he was at that lower level. This is where the God brings a word into his mouth. And you see how close we are in terms. We thought that it was nicely determined. There's the Christian camp and there's the pagan camp, and we have the Holy Spirit, and they don't. This story is mixing it up to show that God is more powerful than all the formulas we learned so nicely. This is why it says in the Bible text that the Lord brought a word into the mouth of Balaam. But there are other moments that it is Balaam who speaks himself, and he says that also in his own words. For instance, see Numbers 24 verse 15 and 16 on the screen. He took up his parable, and he said, and he mentioned his own name, Balaam the son of Beor says, the man whose eye was closed says, who hears the word of God knows the knowledge of the Most High, and who sees the vision of the Almighty falling down and having his eyes open, stuff like that. Where the Jewish prophets in the Bible say different things, and they announce themselves in a different way. Look at Isaiah 40 verse 5, where it says, the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together, for the mouth of God, not Isaiah, no, the mouth of God has spoken it. That's a difference of expressing themselves. Jeremiah, another Jewish prophet, warns against false prophets, which Balaam is, but in his falsehood there's also pearls of wisdom. Interesting. And the Bible mentions it, and those pearls are used in Jewish worship and prayer to show that what is of God can be used, whoever says it, even if it's a bit donkey. Jeremiah 23 verse 16 is an example of that. And we read, thus says Adonai of armies, the Lord of the armies, of the heavenly hosts. Don't listen to the words of the prophets who prophesy to you. They teach you vanity. They speak a vision of their own heart, and not out of the mouth of Adonai. That sounds interesting, and we can say yes to that, but not listening to the words of a prophet requires that you see and realize this is a false prophet. Not easy always. 2 Chronicles 18 verse 22 is another one, where it says, now therefore, behold, Adonai has put a lying spirit in the mouth of these your prophets, and Adonai has spoken evil concerning you. So God sometimes does these things as a test for people to see how their spiritual growth is developing. This is what we're talking about today. A lying spirit is invisible, and it requires spiritual insight, spiritual discretion to be able to see through the words and the beautiful glitter and glamour that this speaker is spreading and showing. We need to dismantle that and see through it in order to test whether it's of God or not. Now there are certain sayings of Balaam which are taken and used into our Jewish prayer book because they were the Lord's. And the Lord is able to bring these beautiful sayings into the mouth of a sorcerer, like God can do this to a donkey. But that doesn't make Balaam better. And the miracle that the donkey can talk is not interesting enough to make a living out of it. It makes the Lord more powerful. Balaam is an example of a believer who shows himself off and who is telling people, look at me, how important I am. He knows the Lord. He uses his name in the words. Read it through and you'll find that out. But he's using tricks. And he sees himself as important. A man who has two tracks spiritually. Balaam was had his heart was divided. He did everything for money, in order to earn a living, and so the bread determined the saying and the speaking, which is deadly. You don't find him in the land of the living. I think according to the Bible, he's a Kassam. He's a fortune teller, and the Bible, as I already mentioned, is calling his sayings Kesem, sorcery, fortune telling. But in some congregations and conferences, he would be called man of God, prophet, and stuff like that. So be careful. See through all these things and grow spiritually. We learn that that who wants to do damage to Israel can turn into blessing when this damage comes to Israel. Israel is sometimes able, and God, of course, as the power above it, to change that. So learn the spiritual discretion between impressive sayings, which are untrue, and non-impressive stuff, which it cannot be important, because look at this, it's so poor and cannot be true, which contain God's word. That's for starters. Let's go to the Haftarah, to the prophet Micha, chapter 6, verse 5 through 8, and read this. My people, remember now what Balak, king of Moab, he talks about what we just read, devised, and what Balaam, the son of Beor, answered him from Shittim to Gilgal, that you may know the righteous acts of Adonai. How shall I come before Adonai and bow myself before the exalted God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will Adonai be pleased with thousands of rams, with tens of thousands of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my disobedience, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has shown you, O man, what is good. What does Adonai require of you but act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God? See the difference between the sacrifice and the good behavior. One of the similarities between the God of Israel and the God of Balak is the sacrifice of animals. But immediately there is a difference as well. Only the God of Israel makes known that his believers should behave justly, rightfully, be faithful and love faithfulness, and together with God you should live your life in a humble way, with a humble character that would add to your spiritual growth. There have been animal sacrifices, yes, but they were on a temporary level. Sometimes there was no temple. At this moment there's no temple already for 2,000 years, but in the New Testament we also see Paul bring animal sacrifices in chapter 21, don't forget it, Acts chapter 21, because you need to realize that these animal sacrifices continued. The Bible is one book. It doesn't stop when you start with the New Testament. It didn't stop because of the New Testament, when you turn the page to that, it stopped because of the destruction of the temple. And I think there is a plan in God's overall picture of what he's doing with the world. At the same time, the Lord says that he favors righteous behavior. Already in the time of the animal sacrifices, but definitely after that time, starting 2,000 years ago. Animal sacrifices were meant to open the eyes for the sacrifice that Messiah would bring. It's a Jewish Messiah that brings sacrifices. The Sanhedrin, Sanhedrin talks about it. The Metatron is used, has fulfilled this incredible, unique sacrifice that Messiah brought. And in the older versions of the Mahzor, the holiday, the feast, biblical feast prayer book of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, this name Metatron with the name of Yeshua is mentioned. I've seen it with my own eyes. So Messiah is not from Crown Heights in New York, and is not the one who did away with the Torah. You need to really learn to see who Messiah really is for your own, as I have to do it myself, for my own spiritual growth. Only then, when God gets the place that he deserves, a Messiah, is it possible to grow. Otherwise, no way. So it wasn't so that these animal sacrifices should never have been there. It's more that I think that the Lord is saying that there shouldn't have been only sacrifices. You need to do something in terms of improving your character. Obedience, broken heart, cleansing, do good, love, be faithful, stuff like that. Then, only then, all the commandments, including the animal sacrifices, will do what they were supposed to do. I have some text. I found some text that I want to show you to see how important in the Bible this idea is of not the sacrifices themselves, but more the human behavior behind it, before, during, and afterwards, is what the importance is in our lives and should be. So we go to 1 Samuel 15 verse 22, and it reads, Samuel said, has Adonai a great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of Adonai? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen more important than the fat of rams. Psalms 51 verse 18 and 19, different in the English version than in the Hebrew, I'm sorry. For you don't delight in sacrifice, or else I would give it. You have no pleasure in burnt offerings. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit. That's where the spiritual growth starts. A broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. Then there is Isaiah chapter 1 verse 11, 16 and 17, and I read, What are the multitude of your sacrifices to me, says Adonai? I have had enough of the burnt offerings of rams and the fat of fat animals. I don't delight in the blood of bulls or of lambs or of male goats. Wash yourselves, make yourselves clean, put away the evil of your doings from before my eyes. Cease to do evil, that's the important thing. Animal sacrifice, easy. Changing your character, not so easy. Cease to do evil, learn to do well, seek justice, relieve the oppressed, judge the fatherless, plead for the widow. Hosea 6, verse 6. For I desire mercy, says God, not sacrifice, and the knowledge of God more than burnt offerings. It's not that we do away with the burnt offerings. See the New Testament in chapter 21, but what God wants more is mercy and the knowledge of God. Amos, prophet Amos 5 verse 22 through 24. Although you offer me your burnt offerings and meal offerings, I will not accept them. I will not accept them. And you think you do holy deeds and God doesn't accept it. Neither will I regard the peace offerings of your fat animals. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the music of your harps, but let justice roll on like rivers and righteousness like a mighty stream. Micha 6 verse 6 through 8. How shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before the exalted God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will Adonai be pleased with thousands of rams? And so forth and so on. I already read this text in Micah 6, so I will not do this anymore. This was the Haftarah text. So it's, I think, an interesting short summing up of texts that show that spiritual growth is depending on the change of our characters. You want to grow? You want to grow more than Balaam? This is what we need to do. There's an interesting short itinerary that you find in this prophet Micah in chapter 6 verse 5 that I want to read to you. It's coming on the screen. My people, remember now what Balak king of Moab devised and what Balaam the son of Beor answered him from Shittim to Gilgal, that you may know the righteous acts of God. Interesting. How can you see the righteous acts of Adonai, which is important for our spiritual growth? We need to see what God does. Not just talk about it, but be silent and watch and observe. And the answer is, and it's a sod. It's a mysterious secret that is revealed to us here. From Shittim to Gilgal. Draw a line from Shittim, city of Shittim, which is a geographical way of expressing a spiritual secret. Draw a line from Shittim to Gilgal, another city, and connect the two, and you have your description of spiritual growth in yet another way. Shittim was a resting place for Israel at the west of the River Jordan. Badly enough, there was a disaster taking place there when Israel started to have sexual relations with other women sent by Balaam as a trick. It was a spiritual contamination. The name Shittim was given because of the many acacia trees there. It was a valley that was dry. And it's interesting that this is a description of ourselves. In the Hebrew, the word of this tree is called shita. And this kind of a tree, this acacia, has long thorns, which probably is the translation in the book of Joshua, in chapter 23, verse 13. Look it up. For whip, shotit. I think it has to do with this word shita. The name Shittim has perhaps to do with piercing. Piercing spiritually has to do with what Messiah went through. But first we are in a dry place because we haven't looked for water, and we should. A tree planted at water streams can do fruit wonders where the dry tree will die. The other place is called Gilgal, and it means wheel. It means a round object. This is the way the name Golgotha came into being, where innocent Jews, and among them Yeshua the Messiah, were executed by very rude, ruthless and cruel and bloodthirsty Romans. It got the name Golgotha in Aramaic. And this biblical secret is now given to us, that we go, if you want to grow spiritually, we go from piercing through and sticking a sharp object into Messiah. This is how God has solved the problem of being able to forgive us and having a guilty one who takes the guilt of us to him. From there to Golgotha. First we hit him, and then we go to Golgotha to ask and to use this ultimate sacrifice for our own well-being. We travel from, we need to, in other words, the secret of spiritual growth is to look at ourselves, and observe what we're doing. And we see when we do wrong, and we see when we are in judgeable behavior. And hopefully we see this while we're doing it, or even before we start doing it, and we say, stop, I can't do that anymore. And we go to the sacrifice of Messiah. Not to put away with our responsibility, but to take upon ourselves all the responsibility. He gives the forgiveness, but we have to work out all the damage we did. And the forgiveness, receiving that forgiveness that only God can give, which is the God of Israel, not the God of Balak and Balaam. The third text is in the Berit Chadashah, in the book of Hebrews, chapter 10, verse 1 through 7. Let's read it. For the law, having a shadow containing a shadow of the good to come, that's not just a shadow, that's the shadow of the good to come. not the very image of the things, but a shadow of the image. That law, this Bible, this first 5 books, can never, with the same sacrifices year by year, which they offer continually, make perfect those who draw near. The Bible isn't able to do that. You read what you read, you compare it to yourself, and you say, oh, woe to me because I did wrong. Or else, wouldn't they have ceased to be offered? Because the worshippers, having been cleansed once, would have had no more consciousness of sins. But in those sacrifices, there's a yearly reminder of sins. For it is impossible that the blood of bulls and goats should take away sins. He is not against Leviticus, where all those sacrifices are explained. He's just saying that it's not the blood itself, or it will be in our own hands to forgive ourselves. It's the blood that we use, and the forgiveness that God gives is in this process. Therefore, when he comes into the world, he says, sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but you prepared a body for me. You had no pleasure in whole burnt offerings and sacrifices for sin. Then I said, behold, I've come. In the scroll of the book it is written of me, to do your will, O God. So there is another very interesting feature of the God of Israel. He is showing us interesting objects from heaven, eternal objects on earth. The book of Hebrews is talking about the law, the Torah. But Moses has also received, besides Torah, the earthly tent of meeting, developing into the temple, and built after a heavenly original, with all the objects inside belonging to it. Now the God of Israel is not doing this to say, see, there's a heaven and work toward heaven, and for later, do this for the later stuff, and you'll be in paradise and stuff like that. All these things that are in the Torah are for us on earth for now, for the time in which we live. It's a hint, it's more than that, to apply all these things on earth. And there's never been a time where we didn't have to do this anymore. The book of Hebrews in particular doesn't do away with the covenant, only changing the priesthood. There is sometimes you see text and the word is lacking, and there are theologians filled in as the word covenant, where it should be the word priesthood, which is much more logical. The covenant never changed, but the priesthood did. There's no temple, and the priesthood has become superfluous. Without temple, no altar, and no animal sacrifices. But yet still Torah in an adjusted form with the same content. Balaam said interesting things because the Lord gave him those words. In another way that Moses received these. And you read that in Numbers chapter 23, verse 1 through 4. Let's read it together. Balaam said to this political leader, King Balak, build me here 7 altars. Where did Balaam get this from? You'll find out. And prepare me here 7 bulls and 7 rams. Balak did, as Balaam had spoken. And Balak and Balaam offered together on every altar a bull and a ram. Balaam said to Balak, stand by your burnt offering, and I will go, because perhaps Adonai will come to meet me, and whatever he shows me, I will tell you. He went to a bare height. God met Balaam, and he said to him, I have prepared the 7 altars, and I have offered up a bull and a ram on every altar, is what Balaam tells God. How would Moses have done this? When would he build 7 altars and then tell God later on, I built 7 altars? Would he do it like that? No. Moses would have built those 7 altars only after the Lord would have told him. With Balaam is doing an interesting thing, which perhaps many of us do. First we do it, then we ask God for his approval, and we show the paper that he can write his signature on after the facts. But that's not the important thing. I want to have your attention on verse 3, where it says, perhaps Adonai will come to meet me. And then also in verse 4, God met Balaam. In the English text, it's not so clear what it says in the Hebrew. In the Hebrew, a special verb is used, and it's the verb kara, meaning to happen accidentally. Even now in modern Hebrew, you use that same verb when you ask somebody what happened. What happened? Ma kara. Or when you meet people and you ask them how they're doing. How are you doing? Ma kore. This is a subtle way in which the Bible is showing in verse 3 and 4 that the meeting between Balaam and the Lord is totally different than between Moses and God. There is this haphazardous kind of meeting where God is totally in control, with Moses also, but there is not this haphazardous kind of meeting. It is a planned situation, because Moses has grown so much higher levels of spiritual growth than Balaam would ever go to. But he had some level, and we need to see, because he is the prophet of the Gentiles. The Lord meets Balaam with a plan, namely to make Israel indestructible. It couldn't be destroyed. And so it became invincible against the rude plans of Balak with the help of the spiritual leader Balaam. Balaam mentions the four-letter name of God, Yud, He, Vav, He, JHWH. But in the text, God changes that, and it says that he met El. Also a very subtle way of showing that although this Gentile knows the name of God, he doesn't know God himself. He only knows him in this generic name of El. God in his general way of being described. Yet in chapter Numbers 24 verse 2, look it up, 24 verse 2, you read that the Spirit of God is upon Balaam. So there is a spiritual growth thing there, and it's challenging all of us. I hope that it does, that we should grow to higher levels than only this level that this guy has with his Gentile way of dealing with these things. So we learn how much there is lacking, while there is some things are already possible. 4 sayings is what Balaam is going to speak, and the leader that invited him to do this is becoming angry because Balaam is opening his mouth and he wants to destroy and to curse Israel, but God doesn't allow him, and only blessings come out of his mouth. So much so that some of them are still in the prayer book, in the Jewish prayer book. In the first one, Balaam says, that is to say, the Lord forces him to say this, that God has not cursed Israel, and that Israel will be numerous and in many multiplication in great numbers. A blessing that Israel is very glad to read there. The second saying, Balaam is saying that the Lord has blessed Israel and that there is no injustice in her enough that would stand in the way of being saved. The third saying, Balaam is saying, Ma tovu ohalecha Yaakov mishkenotecha Israel. In other words, how good are your tents, Jacob, your tents, or temples, O Israel. And you find it in Numbers 24 verse 5. How good are your tents, Jacob, and your temples, Israel. And it's part of the prayer book of Israel by entering the synagogue. The fourth and last saying by Balaam you find in Numbers chapter 24 verse 17 through 19. And I want to read it. It's on your screen as well. There we go. I see him, but not now. I see him, but not near. Talking about Messiah. A star will come out of Jacob, A scepter will rise out of Israel and shall strike through the corners of Moab, the corners or his temples, and break down all the sons of Shet in Hebrew. Edom shall be possession. Seir, his enemies, also shall be possession. This is interesting because other prophets are also saying this, that the dark realm of darkness of Edom will be destroyed, and this guy knows it also. While Israel does valiantly, out of Jacob shall one have dominion, this person, this Messiah, and shall destroy the remnant from the city, the remnant of the enemies. It's a Messiah text about Messiah, as we call him Yeshua, with the final destiny of Edom is Esau. Exceptional, but he doesn't grow on a higher level than this, Balaam, and yet it's some level. This spiritual level you can reach if the Lord allows it, complete with God's Spirit and nice spiritual words. But what do we need to do in order to grow further than this? Because we should not stop at this level. Have you reached this level? Then grow forth. Go forth and grow more. First of all, focus on the God of Israel, who promises love, personal victories, and asks us to live in a humble way. That's the first. The second one is, when you are a child of the God of Israel, you're supposed to have the best and the most beautiful of character and aspects in the other person to come to the surface. And you need to be a participant in this process of growth of this other person that will also impact your own spiritual growth, instead of the best and the most beautiful things in yourself and use others to get that done. Third, the God of Israel requires application of Torah and is projecting and proclaiming and introducing, if this is for the first time for you, Messiah as the one who applies Torah, who is a faithful Torah observer, and is demanding from his followers, Yeshua, the Messiah, mentioned with his name in the New Testament, he's demanding from his followers that we do the same. He doesn't allow us to say the law is fulfilled and we don't have to do this anymore. Read Matthew 5 verse 19 and you'll see those words. There's no mistake, there's no misunderstanding about this. The God of Balak hates the law, hates Torah, hates Israel. Those two go hand in hand. So watch it, how you handle Torah, the spiritual document, as Paul calls it in the 1 Corinthians letter. Fourthly, the God of Israel makes known that his believers should live righteously, have love for faith, for faith, being faithful, and live this humble life with him, hand in hand. 5. Remember this short itinerary from Shittim to Gilgal, where you become aware more and more of your mistakes. The New Testament, particularly the first letter by John, is talking about the same thing. Become aware of the things you do, also the wrong things. Go to God, ask him to cleanse you. Go to Gilgal, be aware of the sacrifice that the Messiah did for you. Talking about Messiah, discover Yeshua. And you might say, well, I know him already. I once said yes to him. Well, learn to get into a process to know more about him. Like perhaps you heard things today that you didn't know before. Add this to your knowledge. Because if you say, I know him, that's all for me, I don't need anything more, you're blocking your spiritual growth. It's very important to know Yeshua. He's never the same. In a sense, he's definitely always the same, but he's never the same in the sense that we have enough filters in ourselves that we are able to block certain knowledge, because we are banking our knowledge on old Sunday school teaching and stuff like that. Learn who this Jewish Messiah is. Very important, with new aspects all the time. And last but not least, realize that God doesn't demand sacrifices, animal sacrifices, which is a word for traditional, written out prayers and certain songs. And we've done our prayers and we've done our songs. We paid our monies to our spiritual house. The most important thing is this change, this improvement of behavior that will bring spiritual growth. Isn't it so that in the Bible it says, in the letter of Peter, wasn't it so, that if we husbands are not behaving well to our wife, that will block our prayers? There is a direct connection with the way we behave and our spiritual growth. That, my dear friends, is very important to realize today. And this story is suggesting all these things to us because they are important, because we want to grow spiritually, don't we? So enjoy the Shabbat, and hope to speak with each other again next week. Shabbat Shalom.